Washington, D.C., 1968. The city was a humid pressure cooker, simmering with a tension that felt physical. The headlines in the Washington Post, left folded on the vinyl chairs of the staff lounge, screamed of riots, of Southeast Asia, of protests that swelled on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. But inside the limestone walls of Georgetown University Hospital, the air was different. It was sterile, controlled, and hushed, existing in a parallel world defined by routine and the quiet beep of machinery. This was the world of Eleanor Vance. Eleanor was the head nurse of the 4th floor, the diplomatic and executive wing. At 53, she was a woman of profound, unyielding order. Her uniform was impossibly white, her nurse's cap a rigid crown of starched fabric, her shoes silent and practical. She had worked this floor for 20 years, seeing the Capitol's most powerful figures at their most vulnerable. Senators with exhaustion, foreign attachés with gastric distress, and shadowy agency men admitted under pseudonyms for conditions never specified on their charts. Eleanor believed in the system. She had seen the Depression and the Great War. She understood that civilization was a thin veneer maintained by protocol. Her domain was managed with a precision that bordered on the severe. She knew the sound of every door hinge, the specific creak of the medicine cart at 3 a.m., and the subtle shift in atmosphere when a VIP was admitted. Her nurses respected her, feared her slightly, and trusted her implicitly. She was the anchor of the ward. In this regimented ecosystem, Arthur Pendleton was a model of quiet efficiency. For 12 years, Arthur had been the senior clerk in the Central Records Department, located in the hospital's basement. He was a pale, thin man in his late 40s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a permanent demeanor of mild apology. He was unmarried, lived in a modest apartment in Arlington, and was known for 2 things: his encyclopedic knowledge of the hospital's arcane filing system and his genuine kindness. He often stayed late, ensuring charts were correctly refiled, and would personally walk a misplaced file up to the wards rather than using the pneumatic tube system. The nurses on the 4th floor adored him. "Oh, Arthur's a saint," they'd say when he appeared with a chart they'd misplaced. Eleanor appreciated his meticulousness. In a world of increasing chaos, Arthur was a fixed point of reliability. He was invisible in the way only the truly essential can be, part of the hospital's plumbing, functioning perfectly, noticed only if he were to stop. He had top-level clearance for the sensitive files on the 4th floor. It was necessary for his job, as he managed the secure vault where the diplomatic charts were stored under lock and key, separate from the general population. He was the man who held the keys, and no one had ever thought to question it. The year 1968 was pressing down on everyone. The Cold War was not a distant abstraction. It was the man in the black car parked across the street, the static on the shortwave radio, the background radiation of daily life. At Georgetown, this tension manifested in the increasing number of special patients, men from the State Department, men from Langley, men from the Pentagon. The 4th floor was, in its own quiet way, a nerve center, and Eleanor Vance, a woman who only wanted order, was standing watch over it, unaware that the threat was not outside the walls, but already had a key to the most sensitive room in the building. The anomalies began as hairline fractures in the routine, so small they were almost invisible. Eleanor, with her auditor's mind for procedure, was the only one who might have registered them, and even she dismissed them as products of the increasing strain on the hospital. The diplomatic wing was fuller than it had been in years. The city's tensions seemed to be manifesting physically in its leaders. The first incident occurred in March. A senator from a powerful committee, admitted for a severe ulcer, had complained irritably that his personal effects had been gone through. A nurse had calmed him, assuring him it was likely just the intake inventory. But Eleanor noted it because the senator was specific. It was his personal briefcase, which held his appointment book and private correspondence, not his suitcase. The case had been locked. It was dismissed. A few weeks later, there was a minor issue with the records. Eleanor had requested the archived file for a French diplomat who was returning for a follow-up consultation. Arthur Pendleton brought the file up himself, as he often did. "Took me a moment to find this one, Nurse Vance," he said, offering his typical fleeting smile. It was slightly out of sequence. Must have been a new resident who misfiled it. Eleanor thanked him. took the heavy beige folder, and thought nothing of it. But as she reviewed the file, she noticed the charge-out card stapled inside the cover. The last entry was from 3 days prior. The signature was Arthur's. He had accessed the file for no apparent reason, just days before the diplomat's visit was even scheduled. When she queried it later, Arthur looked genuinely flustered. "Oh my," he said. "I must have pulled it by mistake when I was looking for Mr. Arno's file. Their names are so similar. I apologize, head nurse. I'll be more careful." It was a plausible, even likely mistake. The filing system was complex. Eleanor let it go. Then came the incident with the new medication. A new tranquilizer, highly effective but still in limited clinical trials, was being discreetly used for a few of the high-stress patients on the 4th floor. Its use was kept off-book, documented only in the nurse's handwritten shift notes, not in the main patient chart, to protect the patient's reputations. One morning, Eleanor was doing rounds with Dr. Bellows, the chief physician, who was reviewing the medication log. "It's remarkable, Doctor," Bellows mused, "how effective this new compound is. But I've noticed a strange pattern. The dosage requirements for Representative Smith and Admiral Cole are almost identical, despite their vast differences in physiology." Eleanor, who managed the locked narcotics cabinet, felt a prickle of unease. The handwritten log was kept in her desk. She checked it. The entries were all correct, in her handwriting or that of her most trusted senior nurse. But later that day, she saw Arthur Pendleton at the nurse's station, dropping off a stack of refiled charts. He was chatting amiably with the unit secretary, asking if her son had recovered from his cold. He had been standing very close to Eleanor's desk. Had he been alone at the station? She couldn't be sure. The thought was intrusive, disloyal even. Arthur? It was absurd. She mentally scolded herself for the paranoia that was gripping the rest of the city. The most significant sign, though it wouldn't be understood until much later, was Arthur's newfound interest in the hospital's pneumatic tube system. The network of vacuum tubes was old, loud, and primarily used for sending lab samples and routine paperwork between floors. Arthur, citing efficiency, had proposed a new labeling system for the capsules. He spent a week in the basement dispatch center, observing the flow of traffic, taking notes on which tubes went where and which were the most reliable. The administration praised his initiative. He was, as always, the model employee, dedicated to the smooth running of the hospital. The discovery when it came was not a dramatic unmasking. It was quiet, bureaucratic, and happened in the sterile, fluorescent glare of the 4th floor nurses' station at 2:17 a.m. The patient was Undersecretary Harrison Thorne. He was one of the key negotiators for the ongoing talks in Paris, a man whose face was frequently in the papers, looking grim and exhausted. He had been admitted to the 4th floor 3 days prior under a strict pseudonym, Mr. Robert Shaw, for what was officially charted as severe hypertension and observation. The real reason, known only to Eleanor, Dr. Bellows, and 2 Secret Service agents posted discreetly down the hall, was a profound psychological breakdown. Thorne was exhausted, deeply distressed, and reliant on carefully managed sedatives. His condition, if known, could jeopardize the talks and his career. His file was a level Omega classification, a designation so high that the file itself was a dummy. The real chart, the one documenting his psychiatric evaluations and heavy medication regimen, was kept in a separate, locked safe at the nurses' station, to which only Eleanor and the attending physician had the key. On this particular Tuesday night, the ward was heavy with the pre-dawn stillness. Eleanor was catching up on paperwork, her pen scratching in the quiet. The phone at the station buzzed, a soft internal line. It was Arthur Pendleton from Central Records in the basement. "Nurse Vance, I do apologize for the hour." His voice was soft, slightly tinny over the line. "I'm doing the quarterly audit of the secure vault, and I found a discrepancy I can't reconcile. It appears the charge-out card for your patient, Mr. Shaw, in 412 was never initialed for transfer from the vault. I have the main file here, but the card is blank." Eleanor frowned. "That's impossible, Arthur. Mr. Shaw's file is a dummy. The active chart is up here with me." There was a pause. "Oh dear," Arthur said. "That is a problem. The auditors will be here next week. I wonder, could I possibly come up and just get the file number and the admission stamp, just to verify against my logbook?" I won't even need to open it. I'll be up in 5 minutes. It was a procedural request. It was annoying, but it made sense from a bureaucratic standpoint. Very well, Arthur. Use the staff elevator, and be quiet. 5 minutes later, Arthur appeared, looking tired and apologetic. So sorry, head nurse. Eleanor unlocked the small gray safe built into the wall behind her desk. She pulled out the thin red folder marked Shaw Robert. She placed it on the counter, keeping her hand on it. Here is the admission stamp. You can copy the number. Thank you, Arthur murmured. He pulled a small notebook from his shirt pocket and a pen. He leaned over the counter to look at the folder's label. As he did, he fumbled, and his pen clicked and fell from his hand, rolling across the counter and dropping to the floor on Eleanor's side of the desk. "Oh goodness, clumsy me," he said, flushing. Eleanor sighed, bent down to retrieve the pen, and handed it back to him. "Here you are." "Thank you," he said. He quickly scribbled the number in his notebook. "And could I just see the physician's signature on the admission form? Just to verify." Eleanor, already annoyed, flipped open the cover to the first page. "Dr. Bellows, there." Arthur leaned in again, squinting. "Ah, yes, perfect. Thank you, Eleanor. You've saved me a headache with the auditors." He pocketed his notebook. "Have a quiet rest of your night." He turned and walked silently to the staff elevator, disappearing as quietly as he had arrived. Eleanor locked the file back in the safe, but as she turned the key, a cold, sharp feeling, clear as ice, settled in her stomach. She walked back to the counter. She looked at the spot where the file had been. Then she looked at the pen she had retrieved, which she had momentarily placed by her blotter. It was a standard, cheap black ballpoint, but Arthur had been holding his own pen when he dropped it. He still had it in his hand. He had dropped a different pen. She looked back at her desk, at the phone, at the heavy, locked safe. Her mind replayed the tiny, awkward interaction. The fumble. The way he leaned in, his eyes not on the label, but seemingly through the folder. The pen. She walked slowly back to the safe and took out the red folder again. She opened it. The admission form, Dr. Bellows' signature. The second page, the psychiatric consult. The third, the medication orders, the heavy doses of Thorazine. All there. She ran her fingers over the pages. Nothing seemed wrong. Then she saw it. On the inside of the thick red cardstock cover, at the very bottom near the spine, was a tiny, almost invisible smear of graphite. It was a smudge, nothing more. But it was fresh. Arthur hadn't just looked at the file. While she was bending down to get the decoy pen, he had done something. He had a pencil? No. She replayed the moment. His hand on the counter. His notebook. He hadn't just been writing. She looked at his notebook. He hadn't been writing in it. He had been pressing on it. Eleanor opened her desk drawer and took out a heavy magnifying glass she used for reading ampule labels. She examined the smudge again. It wasn't a smudge. It was the faint residual trace of a pressure transfer. He had placed a small, thin piece of carbon paper inside the folder, and then, using his notebook for cover, had used a stylus or an empty pen to trace something from the page underneath. The medication orders. It was an old, low-technology trick. It was silent, quick, and left almost no trace, except for the smudge. And the decoy pen, a simple piece of misdirection to draw her eyes away for 3 crucial seconds. Eleanor Vance stood very still. The only sound was the hum of the floor polisher in the distant lobby. She was holding in her hand the evidence of an act she could not comprehend. Arthur Pendleton, the kind, harmless clerk, had just copied the most sensitive medical information in the hospital, and he had used her to do it. Eleanor did not sleep for the next 48 hours. The small graphite smudge on the red folder had become the focal point of a terrifying new reality. Every time she saw Arthur Pendleton in the hallway, his polite, "Good morning, head nurse," felt like a physical blow. She smiled back, her face a mask of professional calm, while her mind raced. Who was he? Who was he giving this information to? The implications were staggering. Undersecretary Thorne's negotiations, his career, his stability, all of it was now compromised. She knew she couldn't go to the hospital administration, not directly. They would prioritize the hospital's reputation. They would conduct an internal review. Arthur would be quietly dismissed. and the problem would be buried. But this was not an internal matter. This was national security. Eleanor had a cousin, a quiet man named Frank, who worked in a boring bureaucratic job at the Department of Justice. At least, that's what he'd always said. But she remembered a family gathering years ago, after her cousin had a bit too much brandy, where he'd hinted his job was more about filing people than papers. She called him from a payphone at a diner 3 blocks from the hospital. She used careful, vague language. "Frank, I have a procedural problem at work. It involves a records clerk and a very sensitive file. I think information is being misplaced. I don't know who to talk to." Frank's voice, usually jovial, was flat and cold. "Don't talk to anyone else, Eleanor. Go home. Stay there. Don't go to work tomorrow. Plead illness. I'll send someone to your apartment. They'll use the name Mr. Harris. Let them in." The next day, Mr. Harris arrived. He was a man in an unremarkable gray suit who looked like an accountant. He introduced himself as Agent Karras of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He sat in her living room, refusing tea, and listened. He did not take notes. Eleanor, her voice trembling only slightly, recounted everything. The file discrepancy, the late-night call, the decoy pin, the graphite smudge. Karras was silent for a full minute after she finished. "You did not touch the smudge," he stated. "No, I locked the file away. It's in the safe. You have told no one else, not Dr. Bellows, not the administrator. No one." "Good," Karras said. "Here is what you will do. You will go back to work tomorrow. You will treat Mr. Pendleton exactly as you always have. You will smile at him. You will thank him for his efficiency. You will not, under any circumstance, change your routine. Your floor is about to become a federal operation. You will be our eyes inside. But you are, from this moment, a civilian asset. Do you understand what that means?" "I think so," Eleanor whispered. "It means you are completely alone. You cannot come to us. We will come to you." The following weeks were a waking nightmare for Eleanor. The hospital, once her sanctuary of order, became a stage. Agent Karras and his team were ghosts. 2 new maintenance men, with blank faces and sharp eyes, spent 3 days repairing the wiring in the records room. A new auditor from a medical supply company spent a week in the basement with Arthur, reviewing purchasing logs. Eleanor was the pivot. She had to continue her interactions with Arthur. "Arthur, could you please locate the archive file for Mrs. Davies?" "Arthur, thank you for handling that transfer so quickly." He remained the same, polite, unassuming, helpful. But now she saw the calculation behind his eyes, the way he observed the nurse's station, the way his gaze lingered on the duty roster. Karras met her twice, always in public, always by chance. Once on a park bench during her lunch break. "He's cautious," Karras said, staring at a pigeon. "He hasn't moved. He knows the Thorne file was sensitive. He's waiting. We need to know his method of transfer. How does he get the information out of the building?" Eleanor had to think. "He carries a briefcase, but everyone does. He eats lunch in the cafeteria, but sometimes he goes to the library." The hospital had a small medical library on the first floor. He says he likes the quiet. The FBI team refocused. The library. It was a low-traffic area, used mostly by residents and physicians. It had a public access door to the street. Eleanor's role was to be the bait. Karras gave her the instructions. "We are admitting a new patient to your floor. He is Mr. Brown. He is a trade attaché from the Department of Commerce. His file is compromised. It will indicate a dependency on restricted amphetamines. This information is false, but it's potent. We need Pendleton to take it." Eleanor felt sick. She was actively participating in a deception, but she nodded. The next day, Mr. Brown was admitted. His file, specially prepared by the FBI and flagged with subtle psychiatric markers, was placed in the secure vault. Arthur, during his routine afternoon rounds to collect discharged patient files, would have access to the vault. Eleanor watched him from the nurse's station, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw him enter the vault. He was inside for 10 minutes, longer than usual. When he emerged, his face was the same pale, calm mask. He nodded to Eleanor and pushed his cart toward the elevator. Karis, who was now posing as a security consultant near the elevator bank, watched him go. He gave Eleanor a single, almost imperceptible nod. The bait was taken. The surveillance was now focused on the transfer. The confrontation was not with Arthur Pendleton, but with the reality of what he was doing. It was a confrontation for Eleanor, who had to watch the mechanism she had set in motion play out, and for the FBI, who finally saw the shape of the entire operation. For 3 days after accessing Mr. Brown's file, Arthur did nothing. He followed his routine perfectly. He arrived at 8:52 a.m., he took lunch at 12:30 p.m. in the main cafeteria. He left at 5:04 p.m. The FBI team, growing frustrated, watched his every move. They searched his apartment while he was at work. It was monastic, clean, and yielded nothing. No cameras, no shortwave radios, no coded notebooks. He was either incredibly clean, or he wasn't the spy. "He's clean," Karis told Eleanor, meeting her in the hospital chapel, the one place with no listening devices. "His apartment is spotless. He has no vices. He's a ghost." "He's not clean," Eleanor insisted, her hands gripping the wooden pew. "He's patient. He's a records clerk. He knows how to wait. He knows how to follow a system. He's waiting for his system." Eleanor was right. On the 4th day, Arthur varied his routine. Instead of the cafeteria, he packed a sandwich. At 12:30 p.m., he left the hospital via the front entrance and walked 3 blocks to the small public park across from the university. He sat on a specific bench and ate his lunch. FBI agents, dressed as students and homeless men, were all around him. He did nothing. He read a newspaper, finished his apple, and walked back to the hospital. He did this for 2 more days. On the 3rd day, a bright, clear Thursday, he sat on the bench, ate his sandwich, and left his newspaper, folded, on the bench when he left. An agent retrieved it. It was just a newspaper. "It's a signal," Karis said, frustrated. "He's signaling his handler that he has a package. The meat is next." The next day, Friday, Arthur left work at 5:04 p.m. He carried his normal, worn leather briefcase. He walked to the bus stop, but instead of taking his usual 5A bus to Arlington, he took the 32B, heading downtown. The FBI team, in 3 separate unmarked cars, followed. Arthur got off at Farragut Square. He entered the main branch of the D.C. Public Library. It was 5:45 p.m., busy with people returning from work. Arthur went to the periodicals section, sat down, and began to read Foreign Affairs. Karis and his team were spread throughout the building. Eleanor, back at the hospital, was finishing her shift, her hands shaking so badly she could barely sign the shift change report. At 6:10 p.m., another man entered the periodicals section. He was unremarkable, middle-aged, wearing a tan raincoat despite the clear weather. He sat 2 tables away from Arthur. Neither man acknowledged the other. The man in the raincoat opened a copy of Das Kapital. After 10 minutes, Arthur stood up, leaving his briefcase on his chair. He walked to the history aisle, pulled a book, and examined it. While he was gone, the man in the raincoat stood, walked past Arthur's chair, and in one smooth, practiced motion, swapped Arthur's briefcase with an identical one he had been carrying. He then proceeded to the checkout desk, borrowed a book on the American Civil War, and left the library. Arthur returned to his table, sat down, read for another 5 minutes, then stood, picked up the new briefcase, and left. "We have him," Karis's voice said over the radio to his team. "Team A, take the handler. Team B, stay with Pendleton. Do not, I repeat, do not apprehend. We let this play out." The confrontation was the exchange. The silent, mundane treason committed in a public library over a shared interest in periodicals. The man in the raincoat, later identified as a cultural attaché with the Soviet embassy, a known GRU officer, was allowed to get in his car. The FBI wanted to see the entire network, but for Eleanor, the confrontation was internal. Arthur returned to work the next Monday, punctual and polite as ever. He smiled at her. "Good morning, head nurse. A lovely weekend, wasn't it?" Eleanor looked at him, the man who had just sold out a patient, who had passed information that could destroy lives, and she smiled back. "Yes, it was, Arthur. Very restful." The lie tasted like ash. She had confronted the enemy, and he looked just like her neighbor. The end for Arthur Pendleton came not with a bang, but with a polite request. It was a Wednesday, 2 weeks after the library incident. The FBI had tracked the handler, identified his contacts, and mapped the small but significant network that Arthur supplied. The information he'd been passing for years was not missile-related. It was compromat. The medical records of generals, the psychiatric files of congressmen, the embarrassing dependencies of judges. He was a weapon aimed at the city's elite, and his ammunition was the hospital's patient charts. Agent Karras had decided to let the handler go. The diplomatic fallout of arresting a GRU officer was too high. The goal was to plug the leak and turn the asset. At 10 a.m., the phone on Eleanor's desk rang. It was the hospital administrator, Mr. Davies. "Nurse Vance, could you please send Mr. Pendleton from records up to my office? We have a query on a billing audit." "Of course, Mr. Davies," Eleanor said. She called the basement. "Arthur, Mr. Davies needs to see you in the administrative suite. Something about a billing audit." "Oh, certainly," Arthur's voice replied, unconcerned. "I'll be right up." Eleanor watched the staff elevator. A minute later, the doors opened, and Arthur walked out, straightening his tie. He nodded to her as he passed the nurse's station on his way to the administrative wing. "Shouldn't be long," he said cheerfully. He never came back. Inside the administrator's plush wood-paneled office, Mr. Davies was not present. Agent Karras was, along with 2 other men in dark suits. Arthur stopped in the doorway, his hand still on the knob. The cheerfulness evaporated, replaced by a profound, sagging stillness. He didn't look surprised. He looked, if anything, resigned. "Mr. Pendleton," Karras said, not standing. "Please close the door. We have a lot to discuss." There was no scene, no sirens, no agents marching him through the lobby. To the rest of the hospital, Arthur Pendleton had simply been called to a meeting. An hour later, 2 of Karras's men escorted him out a basement-level loading dock and into an unmarked sedan. He was gone. The exposure was a carefully managed internal memo circulated the next day. "The administration regrets to inform the staff that Mr. Arthur Pendleton has resigned his position, effective immediately, due to a sudden and serious family matter that requires his relocation. We wish him the best." The nurses on the 4th floor were stunned. "A family matter? But he had no family," one said. "He seemed fine just yesterday," said another. Eleanor just nodded grimly. "It must have been very sudden. We will have to manage until they find a replacement." The real exposure was happening quietly, behind the scenes. Karras, in a series of discreet meetings, was informing the patients whose files had been compromised. This included Undersecretary Thorne, who had since recovered, the senator with the ulcer, and the admiral with the heart condition. There was quiet panic in the halls of the State Department. Careers were suddenly vulnerable. The information was out. The FBI could only mitigate the damage, not erase it. For Eleanor, the sense of unreality was profound. The man she had shared polite mornings with for 12 years was a state-level threat. The system she had trusted had been hollowed out from the inside. The most terrifying part was the silence of it all. The hospital kept running. The charts were still filed. The patients were still treated. The gaping hole left by Arthur's removal was papered over by bureaucracy, as if he had never existed at all. The enemy had been removed, but the victory felt hollow and deeply unsettling. There would be no public trial. A trial would mean exposing the hospital's vulnerabilities, and by extension, the medical secrets of some of the most powerful men in the United States. Arthur Pendleton's case was handled in the windowless, soundproofed rooms of a bureau safehouse in rural Virginia. Arthur, it turned out, was not a hard man to break. He was not a trained operative built for resistance. He was an ideologue. The interrogation, led by Karras, was procedural, not physical. It was a slow, methodical dismantling of a man's life. They presented him with the evidence: surveillance photos from the library, film from the new micro-camera in the records room, where he'd been seen using a pocket-sized Minox camera to photograph files, and the testimony of his handler, who had been quietly detained, stripped of his diplomatic immunity, and persuaded to cooperate before being traded back to the Soviet Union. Arthur sat at a metal table, his hands folded. He had not been recruited for money. He had been recruited 15 years earlier, in the 1950s, by a university professor he admired, a man who was part of an intellectual peace circle. This circle believed that the only way to prevent nuclear annihilation was total parity. If the Soviets knew the weaknesses of American leaders, they argued, it would balance the scales and deter aggression. Arthur, a lonely, intelligent man who felt powerless, believed he was working for peace. He truly believed he was a patriot, saving the world by ensuring no side had an advantage. "You took a man's private medical records, Arthur," Kara said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You took Undersecretary Thorne's psychiatric evaluation. How does that prevent a war?" "Men like Thorne make the wars," Arthur said, his voice soft. "They are unstable. They are arrogant. They needed to be understood. If their counterparts know they are ill, they will not mistake their illness for aggression. It promotes stability." "You gave them a weapon," Karras countered. "You gave them a tool for extortion. They don't want to understand the senator. They want to control him. They know about his son's condition, thanks to you. They know about the admiral's dependency, thanks to you. You didn't balance the scales. You gave the enemy a fist to put on it." Arthur's composure finally cracked. He was not a bad man, only a profoundly naive one, and the weight of Karras's logic, the cold reality of how his information would be used, crushed his ideological framework. He had thought he was a philosopher. The FBI showed him he was a pawn. While Arthur was being debriefed, Eleanor underwent her own interrogation. Karras and a stern-looking woman from Internal Affairs debriefed her for 7 hours. They went over every detail, every conversation she'd ever had with Arthur, every file he'd ever touched. They cross-referenced her memories with his confessions. Eleanor felt less like a hero and more like a suspect. They probed her judgment. "Why did you not report the misfiled chart in March, Nurse Vance? Did you ever leave the secure key unattended? Were you familiar with Pendleton outside of work?" She answered with cold, precise honesty. By the end, she was exhausted. Karras finally closed his notebook. "You did well, Nurse Vance. Your observations were critical. The Bureau appreciates your service. What will happen to him?" she asked. "He is cooperating. He will enter the Federal Witness Program. He will be given a new name, a new identity, and a new job as a records clerk in a shoe factory in Ohio. He will never be seen again." "And the hospital?" "The hospital," Karras said, standing, "will implement new security protocols recommended by my consulting firm. New badges, new locks, new procedures for file access. The vulnerability has been addressed." Eleanor returned to her empty apartment. The case was closed. Arthur was gone. But the vulnerability Karras spoke of didn't feel addressed. It felt like it had just moved, shifted, from the man named Arthur to the system itself, a system that now included her. The immediate aftermath was a flood of sterile, gray bureaucracy. Agent Karras's consulting firm descended on the hospital. The quiet, trust-based system Eleanor had inhabited for 2 decades was dismantled and replaced with one of cold, hard security. The locks on the nurses' station, the records room, and the secure vault were replaced with new, high-security cylinders. A new sign-in, sign-out procedure was implemented for all secure files, requiring 2 signatures: the requesting nurse and the new, humorless records clerk who replaced Arthur. Every request was time-stamped. Pneumatic tubes were banned for any patient-related material. The staff hated it. The new rules were cumbersome, slow, and implied a deep-seated mistrust. "It's like Fort Knox," the younger nurses complained. "It takes 10 minutes just to get a chart for a headache." They blamed the administration, the insurance companies, the government, an abstract them. Only Eleanor knew the precise reason for the new regime. Her relationship with her own ward, her domain, was fractured. She, who had always been the paragon of order, now felt like a ghost in her own life. She looked at her colleagues, women she had worked with for a decade, and wondered, if Arthur, so kind and reliable, could be a traitor, who else? The friendly Dr. Bellows? The gossipy unit secretary? The new maintenance man? Paranoia, once a foreign concept, became her constant companion. She began double-checking the locks on the medicine cabinet, then triple-checking. She found herself watching the new records clerk, a young, efficient man named Peters, with a hawk-like intensity. When he stayed late one evening, she felt a jolt of panic. only to find he was simply reorganizing the new complex filing system. Her personal life, already quiet, evaporated. She stopped attending the occasional staff potluck. She declined invitations for coffee. The small human connections that had made the high-stress job bearable were severed by the invisible wires of suspicion. She did her job perfectly, rigidly, but the warmth was gone. She was no longer just the head nurse, she was a warden. The political consequences were, like Arthur's arrest, silent and devastating. Undersecretary Thorne, his stability privately questioned, was quietly reassigned from the Paris talks to a less strenuous diplomatic post in South America. The senator whose file Arthur had accessed suddenly dropped his opposition to a key trade bill with the Soviet bloc, citing a change of heart after a productive discussion. The admiral with the heart condition took an early retirement, citing personal health reasons. No one connected the dots. There was no scandal in the post. But the information Arthur had stolen had done its work. The balance he had sought was achieved, not through peace, but through quiet, personal defeats managed by unseen handlers. Eleanor saw the admiral's retirement announcement and felt a cold wave of nausea. She had plugged the leak, but the poison was already in the water supply. Years passed. The 1960s gave way to the 1970s. The Vietnam War ended. Watergate erupted, confirming for Eleanor that her paranoia was merely a symptom of the times. The world of spies and secret loyalties, which had once seemed like the fantastic plot of a novel, was now simply the fabric of reality. Eleanor Vance retired in 1985. She had remained head nurse of the 4th floor for another 17 years. The strict security protocols she helped implement became the national standard for hospital security, especially in Washington. The Vance protocols, as they were informally known by administrators, were her unintended legacy, a system of locks and ledgers born of one man's quiet betrayal. She moved to a small coastal town in Maine, far from the humidity and political intrigue of Washington. She lived in a small cottage, gardened, and rarely spoke of her time at the hospital. The nurses who had trained under her remembered her as a legend, a tough, fair, almost mythical figure of competence. None of them ever knew the story of Arthur Pendleton. It remained locked in a classified FBI file, a minor footnote in the vast, secret history of the Cold War. Arthur Pendleton, now Paul Weber, lived a life of profound mediocrity in Des Moines, Iowa. He worked as an inventory manager for a tire company. He was, by all accounts, a model employee, quiet, efficient, meticulous. He never married. He never spoke of politics. The passion that had driven him to balance the scales had been extinguished, replaced by a quiet, perpetual fear. He attended a local Lutheran church, bowled on Tuesdays, and was terrified of library books. He passed away from a heart attack in 1993, and his obituary was 3 lines long in the local paper. Agent Karras rose high within the Bureau. He became a specialist in counterintelligence, known for his cold, analytical approach to human vulnerabilities. The Georgetown Hospital case became a textbook example he taught at Quantico. Espionage wasn't about secret formulas, it was about exploiting the mundane. The weakest link was never the technology. It was the overlooked clerk, the underpaid technician, the trusted nurse. The hospital itself thrived. It remained the premier institution for the Washington elite. The 4th floor was renovated, the old safe replaced with a computerized record system, the pneumatic tubes sealed in the walls like ancient arteries. The new threats were digital, but the targets were the same. The story of Eleanor Vance and Arthur Pendleton was never a story about high-stakes chases or dramatic confrontations. It was a case study in the quiet, corrosive nature of ideological conflict. It was a war fought not on a battlefield, but in a hospital filing cabinet. The true casualty was not the information, which was ultimately managed, or the spy, who was neutralized. The true casualty was the trust that holds a system together. Arthur's betrayal was not just against his country, it was against his colleagues. He weaponized their kindness, their faith in his harmlessness. Eleanor, in her retirement, often reflected on the moral calculus of her actions. She had done her duty. She had followed protocol. She had protected her patients and her country. But to do so, she had to become a participant in the deception. She had to use her position of trust to set a trap. She had to live a lie, smiling at the man she knew was a threat. This necessary duplicity hollowed out her own sense of order. She had won, the system had won, but the cost was the very sense of security she had been fighting to protect. She realized that the Cold War was not a conflict between two superpowers, but a condition. It was a psychological state of permanent low-grade suspicion. It was the graphite smudge on the inside of the folder, the decoy pen dropped on the floor, the polite morning greeting from a man who was simultaneously ruining lives. The real battle was not for territory, but for information. And the true vulnerabilities were not in fortresses or missile silos, but in the most human, unguarded places. A doctor's confidential notes, a man's private fears, and the quiet, trusting heart of a dedicated nurse. Eleanor had learned the hard way that in the war of shadows, the brightest lights of procedure and protocol often cast the darkest, most unexpected shapes.